At 40 years old, mountain man Jonah McBride had never touched a woman, until one frozen night a desperate Amish runaway collapsed at his door, bringing with her a storm of passion, persecution, and peril that would shatter his solitary world forever. What happens when a man who spent his life avoiding temptation must choose between his sacred vows and saving the woman who's stolen his heart? Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey of love against all odds, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The wind howled like a banshee across the Rocky Mountain peaks, driving snow so thick that Jonah McBride couldn't see beyond his cabin's frost-covered windows. February in the high country was unforgiving, but he'd grown accustomed to its brutal embrace over the past 15 years. At 40, his weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he stoked the fire in his stone hearth, the orange flames casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of his sanctuary. Jonah had built this cabin with his own hands when he was 25, each log carefully notched and fitted, each stone in the chimney placed with the precision of a man who understood that in this wilderness shoddy work meant death. The structure stood solid as a fortress against the elements, its thick walls lined with books, the Bible volumes of poetry, works of philosophy that he'd collected during his rare trips to town. Most folks down in Cedar Falls thought him an odd duck, a mountain hermit who could quote Thoreau as easily as he could track a wounded elk through fresh powder. But they didn't know his secret. They didn't know why he'd chosen this isolation, why he'd turned his back on the company of women when other men his age were raising families and building legacies. Jonah McBride had made a vow to God at 19, kneeling in the ruins of his family's burned homestead, promising to remain pure until the Almighty saw fit to send him the woman meant to be his wife. 21 years had passed since that night, and his faith had been tested by loneliness so profound it sometimes felt like a physical ache in his chest. The storm outside raged with supernatural fury, rattling the shutters and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. Jonah pulled his wool blanket tighter around his broad shoulders and opened his worn copy of Psalms, seeking comfort in familiar verses. His lips moved silently as he read by lamplight, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen thine heart." Thud, thud, thud. The sound cut through the wind's shriek like axe blows against hardwood. Jonah's head snapped up from his Bible, every muscle in his body instantly alert. In 15 years of mountain living, he'd learned to distinguish between the random percussion of storm debris and something far more deliberate. This was knocking, desperate, urgent knocking at his door. He rose slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding from the chair like a cautious predator. Who would be out in weather like this? The nearest neighbor was 8 miles down the mountain, and the trail between his cabin and civilization was treacherous even in good conditions. Anyone caught in this blizzard would be dead within hours. Thud, thud, thud. The knocking came again, weaker, this time followed by what sounded like a human voice, high feminine, barely audible above the storm's roar. "Please, please, someone help me." Jonah's hand instinctively went to the Winchester rifle mounted above his mantel, then stopped. That voice carried no threat, only desperation. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides and pressed his ear to the heavy oak door. "Who's out there?" he called, his deep voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Please, I'm freezing. I need help." The words were slurred with cold and exhaustion. Jonah's practical nature warred with his caution. Opening that door would let in enough frigid air to drop his cabin's temperature by 20 degrees. And if this was some kind of trap, he'd be vulnerable. But the voice was weak, clearly female, and getting weaker by the second. He lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured his door and pulled it open against the wind's resistance. Snow and ice crystals immediately pelted his face, but what he saw in the swirling white made his breath catch in his throat. A woman stood swaying on his doorstep, her dark woolen cloak crusted with snow and ice. Her bonnet hung askew, revealing strands of brown hair whipped wild by the wind. She was substantial in build, not fat exactly, but solid and full-figured in the way of women who'd lived on farmhouse cooking their entire lives. Her round face was pale as death, her lips blue with cold, and her dark eyes held the glassy look of someone teetering on the edge of consciousness. "Help me," she whispered and collapsed forward into his arms. Jonah caught her automatically, his strong arms wrapping around her considerable weight. She was unconscious, her body limp and cold as winter stone. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes, and her breathing was so shallow he had to press his ear close to her mouth to confirm she was still alive. "Sweet Lord in heaven," he muttered, kicking the door shut behind him and carrying her toward the fire. "What were you thinking, woman, being out in this?" He laid her gently on his rough wooden floor near the hearth, then quickly added more logs to build up the heat. Her clothes were soaked through the wool, heavy with melted snow. If he didn't get her warm and dry soon, she'd die of exposure right here in his cabin. Jonah hesitated for a moment, his vow of purity warring with the practical necessity of the situation. But this wasn't about temptation, this was about preserving human life. He began removing her outer garments with clinical efficiency, his eyes averted as much as possible. Beneath her cloak she wore the plain dress typical of Amish women, dark blue wool, with a white apron, both garments simple and modest, even when soaked with snowmelt. "Amish," he said aloud, the pieces clicking into place. That explained her presence on the mountain. The Amish settlement of Miller's Hollow lay 15 miles southeast, though the trail between there and his cabin was rarely used. But what was an Amish woman doing traveling alone in the dead of winter? He wrapped her in his warmest blankets and positioned her as close to the fire as safely possible. Her breathing remained shallow but steady, and gradually some color began to return to her cheeks. Jonah found himself studying her face as she slept round and pleasant, with full lips and a small, straight nose. She wasn't what most men would call beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something appealing about her features, something that spoke of kindness and strength. Hours passed. Jonah maintained his vigil, occasionally checking her pulse and adjusting the blankets. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but the cabin remained a warm island of sanctuary. As dawn approached, the woman's eyelids began to flutter. "Easy now," Jonah said softly as she stirred. "You're safe. You're in my cabin." Her dark eyes opened, fully confusion and fear flickering across her features as she took in her surroundings, the rough log walls, the bearded stranger sitting beside her, the unfamiliar masculine environment. Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "My cabin up on Eagle's Peak. Name's Jonah McBride. I found you on my doorstep last night, half frozen to death." He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "What's your name, miss?" She struggled to sit up, wincing as movement brought awareness of her condition. Miriam Stoltzfus. Oh my Lord, what have I done?" Her hands flew to her hair, realizing her prayer cap was missing, then to her body, discovering she was wrapped in strange blankets. "My clothes, did you—" "I had to get you out of those wet things or you'd have died," Jonah said matter-of-factly. "Your dress and cloak are drying by the fire. I was respectful. Only did what was necessary to save your life." Miriam's cheeks flushed pink, whether from embarrassment or returning warmth, he couldn't tell. Thank you. I don't remember much after the snow got so heavy I couldn't see the trail." "What were you doing out in that storm? Don't you Amish folks know better than to travel in weather like that?" Her expression darkened and she pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "I was running away." "Running away from what?" Miriam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of sadness that made Jonah's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "From a marriage I don't want, from a life that feels like a cage." She looked up at him, her dark eyes fierce despite her vulnerable position. "My father arranged for me to marry Jacob Weaver. He's 63 years old and already buried 2 wives. He wants me because I'm substantial, good for bearing children and working his farm, but I can't. I won't spend my life being nothing more than a replacement for his dead wives." Jonah leaned back in his chair, processing this information. He knew enough about Amish customs to understand the gravity of what she was saying. Running away from an arranged marriage was essentially rebellion against her entire community, her family, her faith. "So you decided to brave a blizzard instead. I didn't know it would get so bad," she admitted. "I thought I could make it to the English town on the other side of the mountain, find work, start over, but the storm came up so fast." "You would have died out there," Jonah said bluntly. "Another hour in that cold, and I'd have found a frozen corpse on my doorstep." Miriam shuddered, whether from the memory of the cold or the reality of how close she'd come to death. "Perhaps that would have been better than the shame I've brought on my family." "Don't talk like that," Jonah said sharply. "No marriage is worth dying for, or living a lie for if it comes to that." She looked at him with surprise. "You understand most English? Most outsiders think we Amish are simple, that we don't have the same feelings as other people." "I may live alone, but I'm not ignorant," Jonah replied. "I've read enough to know that the human heart is the same whether it beats under plain clothes or fancy ones. Love, fear, hope, despair, those don't care what religion you practice." For the first time since awakening, Miriam smiled, a small tentative expression that transformed her face completely. "You're not what I expected to find up here, Mr. McBride. Just Jonah. And what did you expect? A rough mountain man who would either take advantage of my situation or throw me back out into the storm." Jonah was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I won't lie to you, Miriam. Your situation is complicated. You can't stay here indefinitely. Folks down in town, they talk, and not kindly." "I know," she said quietly. "I just need time to figure out what to do next. Maybe find a way to get to Denver or Colorado Springs where no one knows me." That's a hard life for a woman alone, especially one with no money or connections. Jonah stood and moved to the stove where he began preparing coffee and breakfast. "How old are you, if you don't mind my asking?" 26, an old maid by Amish standards, which is why my father was so eager to marry me off to anyone who'd have me. 26 isn't old, Jonah said, surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. "Any man would be lucky to have a woman with your courage." Miriam stared at him in shock. In her community, her age and appearance had been constant sources of shame. Men looked through her or past her, treating her as a burden to be disposed of, rather than a person of value. "You don't know me," she said softly. I'm not the kind of woman men find attractive." Jonah turned from the stove, coffee pot in hand, and looked at her directly. "Then those men are fools." The simple statement, delivered without any hint of flattery or ulterior motive, hit Miriam like a physical blow. She felt tears spring to her eyes and turned away, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who owed her nothing. "Here," Jonah said, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. "This'll help warm you from the inside." She accepted the cup, gratefully inhaling the rich aroma. "I haven't had real coffee in months. We only drink postum at home. Coffee is considered too worldly." "One of many things you'll discover are different in the outside world," Jonah observed, settling back into his chair with his own mug. "Some better, some worse." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind had shifted, driving snow against the cabin's western wall with renewed fury. "This storm's not letting up anytime soon," Jonah said, glancing toward the shuttered windows. "Could last another day or two easy. You're welcome to stay until it passes. I've got plenty of food and firewood." "I couldn't impose." "You're not imposing. You're accepting help when you need it. There's a difference." Miriam studied his face, trying to understand this man who showed her such unexpected kindness. "Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me except that I'm a runaway who might bring trouble to your door." Jonah was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of long-held convictions, because everybody deserves a chance to choose their own path in life, and because— He paused, seeming to wrestle with how much to reveal, because I know what it's like to feel trapped by other people's expectations. What do you mean? My story's not much different from yours in some ways. I came up here to escape a life that didn't fit who I was inside. Down in town, I was expected to be one thing, to want certain things, to live a certain way. But it never felt right. So I left. But you're a man, Miriam said. Men have choices. They can go where they want, do what they want. Some can. Others— Jonah shrugged. Others have different kinds of chains holding them back. Before Miriam could ask what he meant, a new sound cut through the storm's howl. The distant crack of a rifle shot, then another. Jonah was on his feet, instantly moving to a window and peering through a gap in the shutters. "What is it?" Miriam asked, alarm evident in her voice. "Hunters, maybe, or—" His expression darkened. "Could be someone looking for you." The possibility hit Miriam like a physical blow. Oh no, if my father sent men after me. Would he do that? He might, or the church elders. They wouldn't want word getting out that an Amish woman had run away. It would encourage others to do the same. More rifle shots echoed across the mountainside, closer this time. Jonah grabbed his Winchester from above the mantel and checked that it was loaded. "Get dressed," he told Miriam, tossing her dry clothes toward her. "If someone is tracking you, we need to be ready." Miriam's hands shook as she pulled on her dress, the gravity of her situation hitting her fully for the first time. She'd been so focused on escaping her unwanted marriage that she hadn't considered how far her community might go to bring her back. "What will they do if they find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonah's jaw tightened. "That depends on who they are. If it's your family or church elders, they'll probably just want to take you home for proper punishment and that marriage you were trying to avoid. And if it's not them, then we might have bigger problems." He moved to another window, scanning the white landscape. "There are men in these mountains who wouldn't hesitate to collect a bounty on a runaway, especially if someone back in your settlement is offering a reward." The implication hung heavy between them. Miriam sank into a chair, the weight of her choices crashing down on her. In trying to escape one form of captivity, she might have wandered into something far worse. "I'm sorry," she said, tears starting to flow. "I didn't mean to bring danger to your door. You saved my life, and now I might have ruined yours." Jonah set down his rifle and knelt beside her chair. "Look at me, Miriam." She raised her tear-stained face to meet his eyes. "Whatever happens, you did the right thing by running. A woman shouldn't be forced into marriage like livestock at auction. And I meant what I said about everyone deserving to choose their own path. Even if that path leads to trouble. Especially then." His voice carried a conviction that seemed to come from deep personal experience. Freedom isn't free and it's never safe, but it's still worth fighting for. Outside, the rifle shots had stopped, but both of them could hear something else now. The faint sound of voices carried on the wind, men calling to each other across the snowy landscape. "They're definitely looking for something," Jonah said grimly, "or someone." He stood and began gathering supplies, ammunition, dried food, a pair of snowshoes, heavy coats. "If they come here, I want you to go out the back door and follow the creek bed north until you reach the old mining camp about 2 miles upstream. There's a cabin there that's still mostly sound. You can wait for me there. What about you? I'll handle whoever's coming, but if something happens to me, you keep going north until you hit the main road, then flag down the first wagon or rider you see. Tell them you need to get to Denver." Miriam stood up, surprising him by grabbing his arm. "I won't leave you to face danger alone. This is my problem. I should be the one to deal with it." "You're in no condition to deal with armed men in a blizzard," Jonah said firmly. "And besides, I've been handling my own problems up here for 15 years. I know these mountains better than any bounty hunter or church elder." The voices were getting closer now, close enough that they could make out individual words. Tracks lead this way. Can't be far now. $50 says she's holed up in that cabin. Jonah and Miriam exchanged grim looks. $50 was more money than most mountain men saw in a year, enough to motivate serious pursuit. Bounty hunters, Jonah confirmed, which means someone back in your settlement is offering serious money for your return. They must really want me back for that marriage, Miriam said bitterly, or they're trying to make an example of you. Jonah moved to the cabin's back door, checking that the path was clear. Either way, we're not giving them the satisfaction. He handed her a heavy coat and a pair of his own boots. These'll be too big, but they're better than what you had. Remember, follow the creek north, find the mining cabin, wait for me there. Jonah, no arguments. This is my mountain, my rules. He looked at her seriously. And Miriam, if I don't make it to that cabin by tomorrow morning, you keep going. Don't look back. Don't try to help me, just go. Before she could protest, the voices outside had reached his front yard. Mountain man, we know you're in there. Come out and talk. Jonah motioned for Miriam to get ready at the back door. When I start talking to them, you slip out quiet as you can. And remember, whatever you hear out here, don't come back. Hello in the cabin. The voice was rough, commanding. We're looking for a runaway Amish girl. Figured you might have seen her living up here where you see everything that moves. Jonah took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and opened his front door. 3 men stood in his yard, all armed with rifles and dressed in the practical gear of professional trackers. Their leader was a grizzled man in his 50s, with cold gray eyes and a week's worth of stubble. His companions were younger, harder looking, the kind of men who made their living in the gray areas between law and outlaw. Gentlemen, Jonah said, carefully keeping his own rifle visible but not threatening. Cold day to be out hunting. We're not hunting game, the leader replied. We're hunting a runaway Amish girl named Miriam Stoltzfus, 26 years old, brown hair, substantial build. Her people are offering good money for her safe return. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description, Jonah lied smoothly. Been holed up here for 3 days waiting for this storm to pass. The man's eyes narrowed. That's so, because we followed tracks from the main trail right up to your door. Fresh tracks made sometime last night. Could have been a deer or an elk. All kinds of animals seek shelter during storms like this. Could have been. The man stepped closer, his rifle now more obviously positioned. But something tells me you're not being entirely honest with us, mountain man, and that makes me curious about what else you might be hiding. Behind him, Jonah heard the soft creak of the back door opening and closing. Miriam was away now. He just had to keep these men distracted long enough for her to reach safety. I'm not hiding anything, he said, meeting the bounty hunter's stare without flinching, but I am curious why grown men are chasing after a young woman who obviously doesn't want to be found. That doesn't seem like very Christian behavior to me. The leader smiled coldly. The Amish community wants their property back, and they're willing to pay well for it. That's all the Christian behavior we need to worry about. Property? Jonah's voice carried a dangerous edge. You're talking about a human being, not a piece of livestock. Same difference when there's money involved. The man gestured to his companions. Search the cabin, boys. Our mountain friend here might not be as honest as he pretends. That was too far. Jonah raised his rifle to his shoulder in one smooth motion, the muzzle trained on the leader's chest. This is private property, and you're not welcome here. I suggest you move along before someone gets hurt. The 3 men tensed their own weapons coming up, but Jonah had the advantage of position and preparation. He stood in his doorway with solid cover behind him while they were exposed in the open yard. Easy now, the leader said, though his eyes remained calculating. No need for violence, we're just doing a job. And I'm just protecting my home. Seems we're at an impasse. Maybe, or maybe you're just buying time for your guests to get away. The man's smile returned. Which would mean you're harboring a fugitive. That's a serious charge even up here in the middle of nowhere. The only fugitive I see is a woman running from a forced marriage. Where I come from, we call that freedom, not crime. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, four armed men in a circle of mutual suspicion. The wind howled around them, driving snow horizontally across the cabin yard and making visibility difficult beyond a few yards. Finally, the leader lowered his rifle slightly. You're making a mistake, mountain man. That girl's worth $50 to us, but she'll be worth nothing but trouble to you. Turn her over now and we'll forget you ever interfered. And if I don't, then we'll be back. And next time we won't be so polite about searching your property. It was a threat, plain and simple. Jonah nodded slowly as if considering the offer. $50 is a lot of money, he said thoughtfully. But I've got a question for you first. What's that? If you're so sure she's here, why haven't you seen any smoke from a second fire? One fire might keep one person warm, but two people in weather like this would need more heat than this cabin's putting out. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly not having considered this point. The leader's eyes narrowed as he processed the logic. Maybe you're telling the truth, he admitted grudgingly, but those tracks could have been made by anyone or anything. Tracks in snow don't tell you much except that something passed by. Jonah lowered his rifle a fraction. But you're welcome to waste your time searching empty mountains if it pays the same. The wind gusted again and the leader pulled his coat tighter. This storm's getting worse. We'll check the other cabins on this side of the mountain, then head back to town. But if we find out you're lying, you know where to find me. The three men mounted their horses and rode off into the swirling snow, their forms quickly disappearing into the white landscape. Jonah waited until he could no longer hear their voices before closing his door and slumping against it in relief. Miriam was safe for now, but this was far from over. The bounty hunters would be back, probably with more men and a better plan. And worse, they'd made it clear that this wasn't just about returning a runaway, this was about money, which meant they wouldn't give up easily. He looked around his cabin, taking inventory of supplies and planning his next move. He had enough food and ammunition to last a siege, but he couldn't protect Miriam indefinitely. Eventually, they'd have to make a run for civilization, and that meant traveling through territory controlled by men who saw her as nothing more than a payday. Outside, the storm raged on, and Jonah found himself praying for the first time in years, not for his own safety, but for the courage to protect a woman he barely knew, but had somehow come to care about more than his own solitary peace. The knock in the snowstorm had changed everything. Now all he could do was see where that change would lead them both. The hours crawled by like wounded animals as Jonah waited for the storm to abate, enough for him to make the treacherous journey to the old mining camp. The wind had settled into a steady howl, no longer the frenzied shriek of the night before, but still carrying enough force to knock a man off his feet. He paced his cabin like a caged wolf, checking and rechecking his rifle, organizing supplies. He'd already organized 3 times anything to keep his mind from dwelling on what might be happening to Miriam in that abandoned cabin 2 miles upstream. When the gray light of dawn finally penetrated the storm clouds, Jonah strapped on his snowshoes and ventured out into the white wilderness. The snow had drifted against his cabin walls nearly to the windowsills, and every step required enormous effort as he broke trail through powder that reached past his knees. The cold bit through his heavy coat like teeth, and the wind-driven snow stung his exposed face until he pulled his wool scarf up over his nose and mouth. The creek bed provided some shelter from the worst of the wind, its banks rising on either side to create a natural corridor through the forest. Jonah followed its meandering path northward, his snowshoes leaving deep impressions in the pristine snow. Ice had formed along the creek's edges where the water moved slowly, but the center still flowed freely, a dark ribbon cutting through the white landscape. The mining camp materialized out of the swirling snow like a ghost town, which in many ways it was. 5 cabins clustered around what had once been the entrance to a played-out silver mine, their roofs sagging under the weight of accumulated snow and neglect. Most had lost their windows to vandals or weather, but the largest cabin still showed signs of recent habitation, probably hunters or prospectors using it as a temporary shelter. Jonah approached cautiously, his rifle ready. "Miriam, it's Jonah. Are you in there?" A muffled voice answered from inside. "Thank God. I was starting to think you weren't coming." He pushed open the heavy wooden door to find Miriam huddled near a small fire she'd managed to build in the cabin's stone fireplace. She looked up at him with relief, so profound it made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "How did you manage this?" he asked, gesturing at the fire and the relatively warm interior. There was still some dry wood stacked by the fireplace, and I found matches in an old tin on the mantel. She stood up, brushing ash from her hands. "I may be Amish, but I'm not helpless. We learn to make do with what we have." Jonah felt a surge of admiration for her resourcefulness. Most city women would have frozen to death in such conditions, but Miriam had not only survived, but created a measure of comfort for herself. "The bounty hunters?" she asked, searching his face. "Gone for now, but they'll be back, probably with more men." He set down his pack and began unpacking supplies. "We can't stay here long. This place is too obvious a shelter. They'll check it eventually. Where can we go?" "I don't know this country at all." Jonah was quiet for a moment, considering their options. Every choice carried risks, and he found himself reluctant to make decisions that might put Miriam in greater danger. When had her welfare become so important to him? When had this woman he'd known for less than 2 days become someone worth risking his own life to protect? "There's an old trapper's cabin about 8 miles west of here, up near the ridge line. It's well hidden and most folks don't know it exists. We could hole up there until the weather breaks completely, then figure out how to get you safely off this mountain." 8 miles in this snow. Miriam looked doubtful. "I'm not sure I can make it that far." "You made it from Miller's Hollow to my place in the middle of a blizzard," Jonah pointed out. 8 miles of hard travel is nothing compared to what you've already survived. They spent the next hour preparing for the journey, melting snow for water and eating a sparse breakfast of jerky and hardtack. Jonah fashioned crude snowshoes for Miriam using branches and strips of leather from his pack, not as good as his own, but sufficient for the terrain they'd be crossing. "Before we go," Miriam said hesitantly, "I need to ask you something." "What's that?" "Why are you doing this? Really doing this, I mean. You could have turned me over to those men, collected the reward money, and gone back to your peaceful life. Instead, you're risking everything to help a stranger. Why?" Jonah was quiet for so long that Miriam began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "I told you yesterday that I came up here to escape a life that didn't fit who I was inside. What I didn't tell you was why that life felt like a cage." He stared into the fire, his weathered hands clasped together. "I was engaged once to a woman named Sarah Collins. Beautiful girl, came from a good family, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. What happened? Nothing happened. That was the problem." His laugh held no humor. "I tried to love her, tried to feel what other men felt when they looked at their wives or sweethearts. But every time I thought about our wedding night, about the physical intimacy that marriage required, something inside me just shut down." Miriam felt her breath catch. In her sheltered Amish community, such topics were rarely discussed openly, but she understood the implications of what he was telling her. "I broke off the engagement a week before the wedding. Told everyone I wasn't ready for marriage, that I needed more time, but the truth was I was terrified that I'd never be able to be the husband Sarah deserved. So I came up here and made a vow to God that I'd remain pure until he sent me a woman I could truly love with both my heart and my body." "And have you—" The question slipped out before Miriam could stop herself. "Found that woman, I mean—" Jonah looked at her, then his blue eyes holding an intensity that made her heart race. "I'm beginning to think maybe I have." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks, that had nothing to do with the fire, and something deep in her chest fluttered like a caged bird sensing freedom. "Jonah, we should go," he said abruptly, standing and shouldering his pack. "Storm's letting up, and we need to cover as much ground as possible before dark." They left the mining camp behind and struck out across the mountainside, following game trails and creek beds that only someone with Jonah's intimate knowledge of the terrain could have navigated. The snow was knee-deep, in most places deeper, where it had drifted, and the going was exhaustingly slow. Miriam's improvised snowshoes worked well enough, but the unaccustomed exercise soon had her breathing hard and sweating despite the cold. "Rest," Jonah called after they'd been traveling for 2 hours. He pointed to a cluster of large boulders that offered some shelter from the wind. "We'll take a break here." They huddled together in the lee of the rocks, sharing water and dried fruit from Jonah's pack. Miriam was grateful for the respite, but she could see the concern in Jonah's eyes as he scanned the landscape behind them. "Are they following us?" "Not yet, but they will be once they figure out we're not at either of the cabins." He pulled out a pair of field glasses and studied their back trail carefully. "The snow's covering our tracks pretty well, but a good tracker could still follow us if he knew what to look for." "How much farther to this hidden cabin?" 5, maybe 6 miles. The hardest part's ahead of us. We've got to cross 2 ridges and a valley, all of it exposed to the wind." Miriam nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The cold was seeping through her clothes despite her exertion, and her legs were already aching from the unfamiliar motion of walking in snowshoes. But she'd endured worse things than physical discomfort. Emotional suffering had taught her that the body could bear almost anything if the spirit remained strong. They resumed their journey, climbing steadily toward the first ridge. The terrain grew more difficult as they gained elevation, the snow deeper and the wind more fierce. Several times Miriam stumbled and would have fallen if not for Jonah's steadying hand on her arm. His touch, even through heavy gloves and coat sleeves, sent warmth shooting through her that had nothing to do with physical heat. "There," Jonah said as they crested the ridge. He pointed across a snow-filled valley to a distant mountainside thick with pine trees. "The cabin's in that grove about halfway up the slope. Can't see it from here, but it's there." The valley looked impossibly wide and deep, a white bowl surrounded by towering peaks. The wind swept across it unobstructed, creating mini tornadoes of snow that danced like spirits across the landscape. "We'll be completely exposed crossing that," Miriam observed. "For about an hour, but once we reach the trees on the other side, we'll have cover all the way to the cabin." Jonah studied the sky, noting the way the clouds were building again on the western horizon. "We need to move fast, though. There's another storm coming in." They descended into the valley at a pace that left Miriam gasping, but she forced herself to keep up. The wind hit them like a physical blow as soon as they left the shelter of the ridge, driving snow into their faces and making conversation impossible. Jonah took the lead, breaking trail through powder that sometimes reached their waists, while Miriam followed in his footsteps, like a ship following a lighthouse through treacherous waters. Halfway across the valley, disaster struck. Miriam's makeshift snowshoe caught on a hidden branch, sending her tumbling face first into a deep drift. When she tried to push herself up, pain shot through her left ankle like a lightning bolt. "Jonah!" she called, her voice barely audible above the wind. He turned immediately, wading back through the snow to where she lay, struggling to get her feet under her. "What happened?" "My ankle," she gasped, teeth clenched against the pain. "I think I twisted it when I fell." Jonah knelt beside her and carefully examined her foot through the heavy boot. Even through the leather he could feel the swelling beginning. "Can you put weight on it?" Miriam tried to stand, but the moment she shifted her weight to her left foot, she cried out and nearly collapsed again. "No, it's bad, Jonah, really bad." The situation had just gone from difficult to potentially fatal. They were trapped in an exposed valley with a storm approaching, and Miriam unable to walk. Carrying her the remaining distance to the cabin would be nearly impossible, especially through snow this deep. "Listen to me," Jonah said, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "There's a hunting blind about half a mile ahead, just a lean-to, but it'll give us shelter while I figure out what to do. Can you manage that far if I help support you?" "I'll try." Jonah fashioned a crude crutch from a fallen branch and positioned himself on Miriam's injured side, taking most of her weight as they struggled forward through the snow. Every step was agony for her, but she bit back her cries and focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The hunting blind, when they finally reached it, was little more than 3 walls of stacked logs, with a roof of pine boughs, but it felt like a palace after their ordeal in the open valley. Jonah helped Miriam settle against the back wall, then began removing her boot to examine her ankle properly. The joint was already swollen to twice its normal size and hot to the touch, despite the cold. "Definitely sprain, maybe worse," he said grimly. "You're not walking on this for days, possibly weeks." "Then leave me here," Miriam said quietly. "Take what supplies you can spare and go. I'll wait for the storm to pass, then try to make it back to the mining camp." "Like hell." The vehemence in Jonah's voice surprised them both. "I'm not leaving you to die in a snowbank. You can't carry me all the way to that cabin, and you can't stay here. Those bounty hunters will find us eventually." "Then I guess I better think of something else." Jonah began rummaging through his pack, taking inventory of their remaining supplies. "We've got enough food for maybe 3 days if we're careful. Water's not a problem with all this snow. The real issue is staying warm and hidden." "Jonah, be practical. Your best chance is to..." "My best chance is to keep us both alive and get you off this mountain safely." He looked at her with an intensity that stopped her protests cold. "I told you back at the mining camp that I thought I'd found the woman I've been waiting for. I meant it. I'm not walking away from that, not for bounty hunters or blizzards or anything else." Miriam felt tears spring to her eyes, but they weren't tears of pain or despair. They were tears of wonder at finding herself valued by someone in a way she'd never experienced before. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You've known me for 2 days. How can you be so sure?" "Sometimes 2 days is enough. Sometimes you know things in your heart before your head catches up." Jonah reached out and gently touched her cheek. "I've spent 21 years waiting for something I could never put into words. But when I saw you collapse on my doorstep, when I heard you talk about choosing your own path even if it led to danger, I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were worth waiting for. That everything I've been through, all the loneliness and doubt and wondering if I was broken somehow, it was all leading to this moment, to you." Before Miriam could respond, the sound of distant voices drifted across the valley on the wind. They both froze, straining to listen over the storm's noise. "Tracks lead this way." "Can't be far now." The bounty hunters had found their trail. Jonah was instantly in motion, checking his rifle and scanning the approaches to their makeshift shelter. The hunting blind offered concealment, but no real protection. If the hunters found them here, they'd be trapped like rabbits in a burrow. "How many do you think?" Miriam whispered. "Sounds like more than the 3 from yesterday. They probably picked up reinforcements in town." Jonah's jaw was tight with concentration. "They're still a ways off, but they're definitely following our tracks. I'm slowing you down. If you leave me here..." "Stop." Jonah turned to face her, his blue eyes blazing with determination. "I'm not leaving you, and that's final. We'll figure this out together." The voices were getting closer, close enough now that they could make out individual words. "Trail splits here." "Check the blind first. $50 each if we bring her back alive." $50 each. That meant at least 4 men, possibly more, and they knew about the hunting blind. "They're coming straight for us," Jonah said grimly. He looked around their shelter, calculating angles and cover. "When they get here, I want you to stay down and let me handle the talking. If shooting starts, crawl to the back corner and make yourself as small as possible. I won't let you face them alone. You don't have a choice. You can't run, and you're not armed." His voice softened. "Trust me, Miriam. I've been taking care of myself in these mountains for 15 years. I know what I'm doing." The first hunter appeared at the edge of the clearing, rifle in hand, scanning the area carefully before advancing. He was followed by two more men, then a fourth, all of them armed and moving with the coordinated precision of experienced professionals. "Hello in the blind," the leader called out. "We know you're in there. Come on out and let's talk this through peaceful-like." Jonah stepped partially into view, his rifle held ready but not immediately threatening. "Gentlemen, persistent of you to follow us this far in such weather. Well, when there's good money involved, a little snow doesn't discourage us much." The leader was the same grizzled man from the day before, but now he had 3 companions instead of 2. "You've led us quite a chase, mountain man. Time to end it. End what I'm just traveling through the country, same as you, with stolen property." The man's eyes glittered with cold greed. "That Amish girl belongs to her people, and they want her back. We're here to see that happens. She's not property, and she doesn't belong to anyone but herself." "That's a philosophical debate we don't have time for. Hand her over and we'll forget about your interference. Keep playing hero, and things might get unpleasant." "For who?" The threat was clear in Jonah's voice, and the bounty hunters shifted nervously, spreading out to cover more angles of approach. They outnumbered him 4 to 1, but they all recognized the dangerous competence in his stance and bearing. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the leader said. "We've got you surrounded and outgunned. Be smart about this." "I'm being plenty smart," Jonah's voice carried across the clearing with calm authority. "Smart enough to know that you boys are a long way from civilization, in country that'll kill you if you make the wrong choice. Smart enough to know that dead men don't collect bounties. You threatening us? Just pointing out facts. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and you've already made several. Following tracks in a storm, getting separated from your supplies, traveling without proper cold weather gear." Jonah's eyes moved from man to man, cataloging their equipment and condition. "How much food you boys carrying? How much ammunition? Because this storm's just getting started and it's going to be a long, cold night." Some of the hunters exchanged uncertain glances. They'd been so focused on the pursuit that they hadn't fully considered the logistics of their situation. "Enough talk," the leader snapped. "Bring out the girl, or we'll come in and get her." "You're welcome to try." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring 4 armed men facing one with Miriam's fate hanging in the balance. The wind picked up again, driving snow horizontally across the clearing and reducing visibility to just a few yards. Then one of the younger hunters made a fatal mistake. He tried to circle around to the side of the blind, hoping to get a better angle on Jonah's position. But his movement took him into Jonah's peripheral vision, and the mountain man reacted with lightning speed. Jonah's rifle barked once, and the flanking hunter spun and fell, clutching his shoulder and screaming in pain. The other 3 immediately opened fire, but Jonah had already dropped behind the shelter of the blind's log walls. "Miriam, stay down!" he shouted over the gunfire. Bullets splintered wood and sent bark flying as the hunters poured lead into the small structure. But the logs were thick and well-positioned, providing better cover than the attackers had expected. Jonah waited for a lull in the firing, then popped up and sent another carefully aimed shot across the clearing. A second hunter dropped, this one clutching his leg. "Sons of bitches," the leader roared. "Burn them out. Find something to start a fire." That changed everything. If they set the blind ablaze, Jonah and Miriam would be forced into the open, where superior numbers would quickly overwhelm them. Jonah looked around desperately for options, his mind racing through possibilities. "Behind the blind," he told Miriam urgently. "There's a gully about 20 yards back. When I give the word, crawl that direction as fast as you can. What about you? I'll be right behind you, but I need to discourage these boys from following too closely first." More gunfire erupted as the hunters advanced on the blind, emboldened by their plan to smoke out their quarry. But Jonah had spent too many years hunting in these mountains to be easily cornered. He knew every rock, every tree, every fold in the terrain that might offer an advantage. "Now," he shouted, Miriam began crawling toward the rear of the blind, dragging her injured ankle through the snow while bullets whistled overhead. Jonah laid down, covering fire, forcing the hunters to keep their heads down while she made her escape. When she'd covered half the distance to the gully, he began his own fighting retreat, using the terrain and falling snow to mask his movements. A bullet caught him in the shoulder as he dove for cover behind a fallen log, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Pain exploded through his left arm, but he forced himself to keep moving, drawing his pistol with his good hand. "Got him," one of the hunters yelled. "He's hit." They rushed forward, thinking they had their quarry cornered and helpless. But Jonah McBride hadn't survived 15 years in the wilderness by giving up easily. As the first hunter rounded the log, Jonah put a pistol bullet center mass, dropping the man permanently. The other two skidded to a halt, suddenly realizing that wounded didn't mean defeated. "Fall back," the leader ordered. "Regroup and come at him from two sides." But the storm was intensifying rapidly, and the combination of failing light and driving snow was making accurate shooting nearly impossible. The hunters found themselves stumbling through drifts, losing sight of their target, and growing increasingly concerned about their own survival as the temperature plummeted. Jonah used the confusion to reach Miriam's position in the gully. She was huddled against the far bank, her face pale with cold and fear. "Are you hit?" she asked, seeing the blood on his coat. "Shoulder, not too bad." It was a lie. The wound was bleeding freely and his left arm was rapidly becoming useless, but she had enough to worry about. "We need to move. They'll regroup and come after us again." "You can barely walk and I can't walk at all. How are we going to—" Her words were cut off by a new sound, a deep rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very mountains themselves. Both of them froze, recognizing the unmistakable warning of a grizzly bear awakened from its winter sleep. The hunters heard it too, their shouts of pursuit changing to cries of alarm as they realized they'd stumbled into territory claimed by one of the mountain's most dangerous predators. The bear's roar echoed across the valley, a sound that spoke of ancient fury and territorial imperative. "This way," Jonah whispered urgently, pulling Miriam deeper into the gully. "Bears don't like water. If we can reach the creek—" They half-crawled, half-slid down the slope toward the sound of running water, leaving the chaos behind them as the bounty hunters dealt with their new and infinitely more dangerous adversary. The bear's roars grew more frequent and aggressive, punctuated by human screams and the crash of large bodies moving through undergrowth. The creek, when they reached it, was a ribbon of black water cutting through ice-crusted banks. It was shallow but fast-moving, the current strong enough to sweep away anyone who lost their footing. "We have to cross," Jonah said through gritted teeth. The cold and blood loss were making him lightheaded, but they couldn't stop here. The cabin's on the other side, maybe 2 miles upstream. "You'll freeze to death in that water with an open wound. Better than getting mauled by a bear or shot by bounty hunters." He managed a weak smile. "Besides, I've got something worth living for now." Before Miriam could protest, he waded into the creek, gasping as the icy water soaked through his boots and pants. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, tugging at his legs and threatening to sweep him downstream. But he made it across and turned to help Miriam. "I can't swim," she admitted, fear evident in her voice. "You don't need to swim. Just hold on to me and let me guide you across. The water's only waist deep." Miriam closed her eyes, said a quick prayer, and allowed Jonah to pull her into the creek. The cold was so intense it felt like knives cutting through her skin, but she clung to his good arm and trusted him to get her safely to the other side. They collapsed on the far bank, both of them shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Behind them, the sounds of conflict were fading as the storm swallowed everything in white silence. Whether the bounty hunters had defeated the bear, been driven off, or worse, they had no way of knowing. 2 miles, Jonah mumbled, his speech beginning to slur from blood loss and hypothermia. Just 2 more miles. But even as he said it, both of them knew that 2 miles might as well be 200. They were at the very limit of their endurance, injured and soaked in sub-freezing temperatures with night falling fast. The hidden cabin that had seemed like salvation now felt impossibly distant. That's when they heard it, the sound of a horse's whinny carried on the wind, followed by a human voice calling through the storm. But this voice was different from the bounty hunters, older and more refined. "Hello? Is someone out there? I heard gunshots." Jonah raised his head with enormous effort, squinting through the falling snow. A figure on horseback was approaching along the creek bank, leading a pack animal and moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to mountain travel. "Here," Jonah called weakly. "We need help." The rider spurred his horse forward, and as he drew closer, they could see he was an elderly man with a white beard, dressed in the practical clothing of a prospector or trapper. His eyes widened as he took in their condition, two people, one bleeding and one limping, both soaked to the skin in weather that could kill in minutes. "Good Lord," the old man breathed. "What happened to you folks?" "Bounty hunters," Jonah managed. "Looking for her. We got away, but—" "Say no more." The old man dismounted quickly and began pulling blankets from his pack. "Name's Samuel Hartwell. I've got a cabin about a mile from here, nice and warm with plenty of supplies. Think you can make it that far if I help you onto my horse?" It wasn't the hidden trapper's cabin Jonah had been aiming for, but any shelter was better than dying in the snow. With Samuel's help, they managed to get both Jonah and Miriam onto the pack horse, then began the slow journey to safety. As they rode through the storm, Miriam found herself clinging to Jonah's good arm, feeling his body heat even through their wet clothes. Against all odds, they had survived. But as the adrenaline of their escape began to fade, she realized that their real challenges were just beginning. The bounty hunters might be gone for now, but they wouldn't give up. And somewhere in the growing storm, other dangers waited: cold, hunger, and the growing attraction between two people who had found in each other something worth risking everything to protect. Samuel Hartwell's cabin emerged from the storm like a beacon of hope, its yellow windows glowing warmly against the swirling white darkness. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady column, and the structure itself looked solid and well-maintained, a sharp contrast to the abandoned mining camp they'd sheltered in earlier. As they approached, Jonah could smell wood smoke and something that might have been stew scents that spoke of civilization and comfort in the midst of the wilderness. "Easy now," Samuel said as he helped them down from the horse. "Let's get you folks inside before you freeze solid." The interior of the cabin was a revelation after their ordeal in the storm. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across walls lined with books, tools, and the accumulated possessions of a man who'd spent decades in the mountains. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted, and thick rugs covered the wooden floor. Most importantly, the temperature inside was blissfully warm. "Sit by the fire," Samuel instructed, guiding them to chairs positioned near the hearth. "I'll get some dry clothes and tend to that wound." Jonah slumped into the offered chair, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the full extent of his exhaustion and pain. The bullet wound in his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and his wet clothes clung to his skin like ice. Beside him, Miriam was shivering so violently she could barely hold herself upright. Samuel returned with armloads of dry clothing and clean bandages. "Young lady, there's a screen in the corner there where you can change in privacy. These clothes belong to my late wife. She was about your size, I think." Miriam looked at the offered garments with something approaching reverence. After days in her single Amish dress, the prospect of clean, dry clothing felt like luxury beyond imagining. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're very kind." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Samuel replied gruffly. "Basic human decency doesn't leave folks to die in storms, especially not when they're running from the kind of men I saw heading down the mountain an hour ago." Jonah's head snapped up. "You saw them. 4 men on horseback riding hard for town. One of them looked pretty torn up, like he'd tangled with something with claws. They didn't stop to chat." Samuel began examining Jonah's shoulder wound with experienced hands. "This is going to hurt, son. Bullet went clean through, which is good, but you've lost a lot of blood." The next few minutes were a haze of pain as Samuel cleaned and bandaged the wound. Jonah gritted his teeth and tried not to cry out, but the old man's ministrations felt like fire coursing through his shoulder and down his arm. "There," Samuel said, finally tying off the last bandage. "That should hold you, but you'll need real medical attention once this storm passes. For now, you need food and rest." Miriam emerged from behind the screen wearing a simple brown dress and wool stockings, her wet hair braided down her back. The clothes fit her reasonably well, and the color brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. Jonah found himself staring, struck once again by how beautiful she looked when she wasn't half frozen and running for her life. "Much better," Samuel approved. "Now let's get some hot food into both of you." The stew was thick with venison and vegetables seasoned with herbs that Samuel must have grown himself during the brief mountain summer. It was the first real meal either of them had eaten in days, and they devoured it with the desperate hunger of people who'd been surviving on jerky and hardtack. "So," Samuel said as they ate, "want to tell me what brings an Amish girl and a mountain hermit to my door in the middle of a blizzard being chased by armed men?" Jonah and Miriam exchanged glances, uncertain how much to reveal to this stranger who'd shown them such kindness. "It's complicated," Jonah said finally. "Most worthwhile things are." Samuel poured coffee from a pot that had been simmering on the stove. "I've been living in these mountains for 30 years, son. Not much surprises me anymore." Something in the old man's tone suggested he could be trusted. Slowly, haltingly, Miriam began to tell their story, her arranged marriage, her escape into the storm, finding refuge at Jonah's cabin, and the pursuit by bounty hunters hired by her community to bring her back. Samuel listened without interruption, his weathered face grave as he absorbed the details of their ordeal. When Miriam finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. $50, he said finally. "That's what they're offering for you. That's what the men said." "Interesting." Samuel stroked his white beard thoughtfully. "That's a considerable sum for returning a runaway bride. Makes me wonder if there's more to this story than meets the eye." "What do you mean?" Jonah asked. "Well, think about it. An Amish community has limited cash money. Most of their wealth is in land and livestock. To offer $50 in actual currency suggests either they're more desperate to get this young lady back than seems reasonable, or someone with deeper pockets is pulling the strings." The implication hung heavy in the warm air. Miriam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather as she considered what Samuel was suggesting. "You think someone outside my community is involved?" "Could be. There are men in towns like Cedar Falls who make their living trading in people, not quite slavery, mind you, but close enough to make no difference. A young, healthy woman like yourself would be valuable to the right buyer." Jonah's jaw tightened with anger. "You're saying she wasn't just running from an arranged marriage, she was running from being sold." "I'm saying it's a possibility worth considering." Samuel refilled their coffee cups. "Either way, those bounty hunters aren't going to give up easily. $50 is more money than most of them see in a year." "So what do we do?" Miriam asked, her voice small. "Well, you can't stay here indefinitely," Samuel said practically. "This cabin's well hidden but not invisible, and eventually you'll need to get back to civilization to build new lives for yourselves." "New lives?" Miriam looked confused. "Child, you can't go back to your Amish community now. Whether this marriage business is legitimate or something darker, you've crossed a line they won't forgive. You're in the English world now, for better or worse." The reality of her situation hit Miriam like a physical blow. In her desperation to escape her unwanted marriage, she'd given up everything: her family, her community, her faith, her entire way of life. The magnitude of that loss suddenly overwhelmed her, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Hey now," Jonah said gently, moving his chair closer to hers. It's not as hopeless as it seems. Isn't it? Miriam's voice was thick with emotion. I have no money, no family, no place in the world. I gave up everything, and for what? To hide in mountain cabins for the rest of my life. You gave up a cage, Jonah reminded her. That has to count for something. Does it? What kind of life can I have now? What kind of woman abandons everything she's ever known for the slim chance of freedom? A brave one, Samuel said quietly. The kind of woman who decides her own fate instead of letting others choose for her. But what kind of fate is that? I don't know how to live in the English world. I don't know their customs, their ways of doing things. I can't even read well enough to— You can learn, Jonah interrupted. All of it. Reading, writing, the customs of the outside world. None of that's as important as what you already have. Which is what? Courage, intelligence, the strength to stand up for what you believe is right. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched her cheek. Those are the things that matter, Miriam. The rest is just details. Samuel watched this exchange with the shrewd eyes of a man who'd seen many storms, both meteorological and emotional. The boy's right, you know. I've known plenty of people who had all the education and opportunities in the world, but lacked the backbone to make anything of themselves. Character counts for more than circumstances. But practically speaking, Miriam said, wiping her eyes, what am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? That depends, Samuel said, on what you want your new life to look like. The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. What did she want? For 26 years, Miriam's wants and needs had been defined by her community, her family, her faith. The idea of choosing her own path was both exhilarating and terrifying. I don't know, she admitted. I've never been allowed to want things for myself before. Well, you've got time to figure it out, Samuel said. This storm's going to keep everyone holed up for at least another day or two. Meanwhile, you're safe here and you can start thinking about possibilities instead of just running from problems. That night, Samuel gave up his own bed to Miriam and made pallets on the floor for himself and Jonah near the fire. The wind continued to howl outside, but the cabin's thick walls kept them warm and secure. Jonah lay awake for hours, listening to the storm and thinking about everything that had changed in just a few days. 3 days ago, he'd been a solitary mountain man, content with his books and his isolation, secure in his conviction that he was waiting for God to send him the right woman. Now he was wounded, hunted, and completely certain that he'd found her. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 21 years in celibate isolation only to fall in love with a woman he might not be able to protect. Jonah. Miriam's soft voice came from the darkness near the bed. Are you awake? Yes. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see those men with their guns, or I think about my family discovering I'm gone. They're probably worried sick about you. No, Miriam said with quiet certainty. They're probably relieved. One less burden to worry about, one less mouth to feed. My father will tell the community I was willful and disobedient, that my rebellion brought shame on the family. They'll pray for my soul and move on with their lives. You don't really believe that, don't I? There was pain in her voice, old pain that went deeper than their current troubles. I was the daughter who was too fat, too plain, too outspoken, the one who asked too many questions and never quite fit the mold of proper Amish womanhood. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life feeling like a disappointment to everyone around you? Jonah was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own years of feeling different, of struggling with urges and desires that didn't match what society expected of him. Yes, he said finally, I do know what that's like. Then you understand why I had to leave. Even if I fail, even if I end up alone and destitute at least, I'll know I tried to be true to myself. You won't fail. Jonah's voice carried absolute conviction. And you won't be alone. How can you be so sure? Because I won't let you be alone. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together. Jonah, you barely know me. You can't just— I can and I am. He sat up on his pallet, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. I told you before that I've been waiting my whole life for something I couldn't name. Well, now I can name it. I was waiting for you, Miriam. For a woman brave enough to risk everything for freedom, smart enough to see through the lies people tell themselves, strong enough to choose love over security. Love? The word came out as barely a whisper. Yes, love, I know it's crazy, I know it's too fast. But there it is. I love you, Miriam Stoltzfus. I love your courage and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to let the world make you smaller than you are. Tears were flowing freely down Miriam's cheeks again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. No one had ever spoken to her the way Jonah did, with such complete acceptance and admiration. In her community, love was a luxury that came after duty, after obedience, after conformity. The idea that someone could love her for the very qualities that had made her an outcast was almost too wonderful to believe. I love you too, she whispered. I think I started loving you the moment you wrapped me in blankets and didn't ask for anything in return. From across the room came the sound of Samuel clearing his throat. Well, this is all very touching, but perhaps we should discuss practical matters, like what you two lovebirds plan to do when this storm passes and the real world comes calling again. Jonah couldn't help but smile at the old man's blunt interruption. Any suggestions? As a matter of fact, yes. Samuel sat up on his own pallet, his form silhouetted against the dying fire. I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I have a solution that might work for everyone. We're listening, Miriam said. There's a town called Silver Creek, about 40 miles north of here, over the Continental Divide. It's a mining town mostly, but it's growing fast, and they're always in need of honest, hard-working folks. More importantly, it's far enough from Amish country that your people aren't likely to come looking for you there. What would we do in Silver Creek? Jonah asked. Well, that depends on your skills and ambitions. Jonah, you know these mountains better than most men know their own backyard. Silver Creek's surrounded by wilderness that needs guides, hunters, and men who can find their way through country that would kill city folks. There's good money in that kind of work. And Miriam, the town's got maybe 3 women for every 20 men. A woman who can cook, sew, teach children, or run a boarding house can write her own ticket, especially if she's got a good man to protect her interests. The plan had merit, but it also had obvious challenges. 40 miles through mountain country in winter was no casual journey, especially with bounty hunters potentially still searching for them. How would we get there safely? Miriam asked. That's the tricky part, Samuel admitted. The main trails between here and Silver Creek pass through Cedar Falls, which is probably crawling with men looking for you by now. But there is another way, an old Indian trail that goes over the high passes. It's harder traveling, but it's isolated. If you could make it to the divide, you'd be home free. In winter, Jonah sounded skeptical. Those high passes are death traps when the snow's deep. Under normal circumstances, yes. But I've been watching the weather patterns, and I think we're due for a warming spell in the next few days. If you timed it right, you might be able to get through before the next big storm. It was risky, but then again, everything about their situation was risky. Staying hidden in the mountains indefinitely wasn't a real option, and eventually the bounty hunters would expand their search area to include Samuel's cabin. There's something else to consider, Samuel said quietly. Those men who were chasing you, they're not going to give up just because they lost your trail in a storm. They'll be back with more men, better equipment, and a more systematic search plan. Your only real chance is to get completely out of the area before they can organize properly. The weight of the decision settled over them like a heavy blanket. Everything they'd been through, the escape, the pursuit, the growing love between them, had been leading to this moment of choice. Stay and risk capture, or venture into the unknown with only each other for certainty. How long would we have to prepare? Jonah asked. The storm should blow itself out by tomorrow evening. If the weather breaks the way I think it will, you could leave the following morning and reach the divide in 2 days of hard traveling. That's not much time to get ready for a journey like that. No, it's not. But time is a luxury you don't have. Samuel stood and moved to a window peering out into the storm. I can outfit you with supplies, maps, cold weather gear. I've even got a spare rifle to replace the one you lost, but the decision to go has to be yours. Jonah looked at Miriam, trying to read her expression in the firelight. What do you think? I think, Miriam said slowly, that we've come too far to turn back now, and I think hiding in these mountains forever isn't really living, it's just another kind of cage. So we go to Silver Creek. We go to Silver Creek. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, filled with the same determination that had driven her out into the blizzard in the first place. We build the life we want together, and we don't let anyone else's expectations define who we're supposed to be. That's settled then, Samuel said with satisfaction. We'll spend tomorrow getting you equipped and planning your route. Day after that, you start your new life. But even as they made their plans, none of them could have anticipated the complication that would arise with the dawn. The storm that had seemed like their protection was also concealing movements in the valley below, and when morning came, it would bring visitors that would test their resolve and their love in ways none of them could have imagined. Outside, the wind continued its relentless howl, but inside the warm cabin, two people who had found love against all odds began to dream of a future where they could be free to choose their own destiny. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't facing the unknown alone. The fire burned low as they finally drifted off to sleep, and in their dreams they saw mountains giving way to valleys, winter giving way to spring, and loneliness giving way to a love that could weather any storm the world might send their way. Dawn brought an eerie silence that seemed to press against the cabin walls like a living thing. The wind had finally died during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it had erased all familiar landmarks. Jonah woke first, his shoulder aching, but the fever that had threatened the night before notably absent. Through the frost-covered window he could see sunlight filtering through breaking clouds, the first real sunshine they'd seen in days. Storm's breaking, Samuel observed, emerging from the kitchen area with coffee and the smell of frying bacon. Just like I predicted. We'll have maybe 2 days of decent weather before the next front moves in. Miriam stirred from her place by the fire, her hair tousled and her face still soft with sleep. For a moment, watching her wake up in the golden morning light, Jonah could almost forget the danger surrounding them and simply appreciate the miracle of finding someone to love in the vast loneliness of the mountains. "How's the ankle?" he asked, as she carefully tested her weight on the injured foot. "Better, still tender, but I think I can walk on it if I'm careful." She moved to the window and gazed out at the transformed landscape. It's beautiful, like the whole world has been made new. Beautiful and dangerous. Samuel warned, setting plates of food on the rough wooden table. That much fresh snow means avalanche conditions on the high slopes. You'll need to be extra careful choosing your route. They ate breakfast while Samuel spread hand-drawn maps across the table, pointing out the route that would take them to Silver Creek while avoiding the main roads where bounty hunters might be watching. "The Indian Trail starts about 5 miles north of here," he explained, tracing a faint line across the topographical sketch. "It follows this ridgeline up to the divide, then drops down into the Silver Creek Valley. It's steep going, especially with all this fresh snow, but it's the safest way to travel without being seen." "How long since anyone's used that trail?" Jonah asked, studying the route carefully. "Hard to say. Maybe a year, maybe more. The Indians who made it originally haven't been through this country in decades, and most white folks don't even know it exists." Samuel pointed to several locations marked with small X's. "These are shelter caves, natural formations, where you can hole up if the weather turns bad. I've cached supplies in a couple of them over the years." Miriam traced the route with her finger, her expression thoughtful. "It looks like we'd be completely cut off from help if something went wrong. No way to turn back, no way to get word to anyone." "That's true," Samuel admitted, "but it's also what makes the route safe from pursuit. Those bounty hunters aren't going to risk their necks on a trail that dangerous unless they're absolutely certain you're on it. What about provisions? Jonah asked practically. How much can we carry and still move fast enough to beat the weather? I've been thinking about that. Samuel moved to a large trunk in the corner and began pulling out equipment. You'll need to travel light but smart. These packs will carry enough food for 4 days if you're careful. Water's not a problem, you'll be following streams most of the way. The real challenge is staying warm and dry. He handed them heavy woolen coats lined with fur, sturdy boots designed for mountain travel, and packs that had clearly seen hard use but were still in excellent condition. This gear belonged to my son, Samuel said quietly. He was about your size, Jonah, and these clothes served him well in country like you'll be crossing. Miriam picked up on the past tense immediately. Avalanche took him 3 winters ago up near the Continental Divide. He was guiding some Eastern gentlemen who thought they knew better than the mountain. Samuel's voice carried old grief, carefully controlled but never fully healed. Point is, respect the mountain, listen to what it's telling you, and don't take chances you don't have to take. The morning passed quickly as they prepared for the journey. Samuel proved to be remarkably well equipped for outfitting travelers, producing everything from spare ammunition to a small medical kit. Most importantly, he provided detailed instructions about recognizing dangerous snow conditions and reading weather signs. Remember, he emphasized as he showed Jonah how to test snow stability. An avalanche doesn't give you a second chance. If you hear that whooping sound underfoot, or if you see cracks spreading in the snow around you, get off that slope immediately. What about animals? Miriam asked. Bears, wolves, mountain lions. Most bears should still be sleeping, but the storm might have disturbed some of them. Wolves generally avoid humans unless they're desperate. Mountain lions? Samuel shrugged. They're hunters, but they prefer easier prey than armed humans. Make noise when you're traveling, don't corner anything, and keep your fire burning bright at night. By midday, they were as ready as circumstances would allow. The packs were loaded, the route memorized, and the weather holding steady with clear skies and reasonable temperatures. But as they prepared to leave Samuel's sanctuary, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the thin mountain air. Company, Samuel said grimly, moving to a window that offered a view down the valley. 4 riders coming up the creek trail, and they're not traveling like men who are lost. Jonah grabbed the spare rifle Samuel had provided and positioned himself where he could cover the cabin's front approach. The bounty hunters, different men, Samuel said, studying the approaching riders through a pair of field glasses. But they're asking questions of my nearest neighbor down the valley. Looks like they're conducting a systematic search. We need to go. Now. Miriam was already shouldering her pack, her face pale but determined. The back trail, Samuel agreed. You can reach the Indian trail from that direction without being seen from the valley. But even as they prepared to leave through the cabin's rear door, the lead rider below raised his hand and pointed directly toward Samuel's cabin. Whatever questions they'd been asking had produced answers, and those answers were bringing armed men to their sanctuary. They know we're here, Jonah said, checking his rifle one final time. Question is, do we run or fight? You run, Samuel said firmly. I'll delay them as long as possible, make them think you headed in a different direction. We can't leave you to face them alone. You can and you will. The old man's voice brooked no argument. I've been handling my own problems in these mountains longer than you. You've been alive, son. Besides, they want you two alive. That bounty's no good if you're dead. They're not likely to kill an old man who's just giving them wrong directions. The riders were close enough now that individual voices could be heard, rough men calling to each other as they spread out to surround the cabin. These weren't the same bounty hunters from the day before. These were new faces, which meant word of the reward had spread beyond the original group. Go, Samuel urged, opening the back door and scanning the tree line. Follow the creek upstream for about a mile, then cut north toward the ridge. You'll pick up the Indian Trail where it crosses the saddle between those two peaks." "Samuel," Miriam said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet, child. Thank me when you're safe in Silver Creek with a new life ahead of you." He smiled, but his eyes remained watchful. "Now go before those boys get close enough to cut off your escape route." They slipped out the back door and into the forest, moving as quietly as possible through snow that muffled their footsteps, but also made rapid movement difficult. Behind them they could hear voices at Samuel's front door, the old man's calm responses to increasingly aggressive questions. "We know they were here," one of the bounty hunters was saying. "Fresh tracks all around your cabin and 2 sets of prints leading right up to your door." "Lots of folks pass through these mountains," Samuel replied calmly. "Can't say I remember everyone who stops by looking for shelter. This isn't some casual traveler we're tracking, old man. We're talking about serious money here, enough to make it worth your while to cooperate." Jonah and Miriam pressed deeper into the forest, using the sound of the conversation to mask their movement. The creek Samuel had mentioned ran clear and cold, about 50 yards behind the cabin, its banks lined with willows and aspen that provided additional cover. "You think he'll be all right?" Miriam whispered as they reached the water's edge. "Samuel's been taking care of himself up here longer than we've been alive," Jonah replied, but concern was evident in his voice. "He knows how to handle men like that." They followed the creek upstream, staying in the tree line where possible and moving in the shadow of the valley walls. The going was slow. Both of them were still recovering from their previous ordeal, and the deep snow made every step an effort. But gradually they gained elevation, leaving the valley floor behind as they climbed toward the high country where the Indian Trail would take them over the divide. An hour into their journey, the sound of a gunshot echoed across the mountainside, followed by angry shouting. Both of them froze, hearts pounding, as they listened for any indication of what had happened at Samuel's cabin. "Could be a warning shot," Jonah said hopefully, "or maybe Samuel convinced them to look somewhere else." But more shots followed, and the shouting grew more intense before finally fading into silence. Whatever had happened back at the cabin, their sanctuary was gone, and there was no going back. "We keep moving," Jonah said grimly. "It's what Samuel would want us to do." The Indian Trail, when they finally found it, was barely visible under the snow, just a slight depression in the mountainside that marked where countless feet had worn a path through the wilderness generations ago. It switchbacked up the slope at a steep angle, requiring them to stop frequently to catch their breath in the thin air. "How high are we going?" Miriam asked during one of their rest stops, looking up at the towering peaks that surrounded them. "The divide's at about 11,000 feet, Jonah replied, consulting Samuel's map. "We're probably at 8,000 now, so we've got a ways to climb." The higher they went, the more spectacular the views became. Below them, the valley where Samuel's cabin sat was just a dark scar in an endless expanse of white. Above them, the peaks rose like cathedral spires against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. But the beauty came with increasing danger. The snow was deeper up here, and the wind that had died in the valley was still howling across the exposed ridges. Several times they had to detour around areas where recent avalanches had scoured the mountainside clean, leaving behind unstable snowfields that could collapse without warning. "Look," Miriam said, pointing to something dark moving far below them on the valley floor. "Riders!" Jonah pulled out the field glasses Camille had included in their equipment and focused on the distant figures. 6 men on horseback were following the creek trail, moving slowly but steadily in their direction. "They found our tracks," he said. "Samuel must have told them something, or they figured out which way we went on their own." "How long before they reach the Indian Trail?" "A couple hours, maybe more, if they have trouble following our sign through the trees." Jonah collapsed the glasses and shouldered his pack. "But once they find this trail, they'll know exactly where we're headed." "Can they follow us all the way to the divide?" "Depends how badly they want that bounty money and how much they know about mountain travel." Jonah's expression was grim as he calculated distances and timing. The smart thing would be for them to circle around and try to cut us off on the other side of the pass, but that would require local knowledge they might not have. They pressed on, driving themselves harder as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous as they climbed, requiring them to use their hands as much as their feet in some places. Miriam's ankle, which had seemed better that morning, began to throb again under the strain. "I'm slowing you down," she said during a brief rest, massaging the injured joint. "We're in this together," Jonah replied firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it together. But if I can't keep up, then we'll figure something else out." He looked at her seriously. "I meant what I said back at Samuel's cabin. I'm not leaving you, Miriam. Not for bounty hunters, not for weather, not for anything." As if summoned by his mention of weather, clouds began building on the western horizon, dark and threatening against the clear blue sky. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of snow and the promise of another storm. "How much farther to the divide?" Miriam asked, pulling her coat tighter against the increasing cold. "Maybe 3 miles, but the hardest 3 miles of the whole journey." Jonah pointed to a saddle between 2 peaks that looked impossibly high and far away. "That's where we're headed. Once we get through there, it's all downhill to Silver Creek." They climbed in silence for the next hour, conserving their breath for the effort of moving through snow that was now waist-deep in places. The trail disappeared entirely in some sections, forcing them to navigate by landmarks and instinct. Several times they had to backtrack when they chose the wrong route. Precious time lost as the storm clouds continued to build. By late afternoon, they were still a mile short of the divide when the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle, fluffy flakes of a casual snowfall, but the hard-driving pellets that promised a serious storm. "We need shelter," Jonah said, scanning the mountainside for any feature that might provide protection. "If this storm hits while we're exposed on the ridge, we won't survive it." "What about one of those caves Samuel mentioned?" Jonah consulted the map, trying to orient himself in the increasingly poor visibility. "There should be one about half a mile ahead, just below the trail on the north side of the ridge." They pushed forward through the worsening weather snow, stinging their faces and the wind threatening to knock them off their feet. The temperature was dropping rapidly and ice was beginning to form on their clothes and equipment. The cave, when they finally found it, was little more than a shallow depression in the rock face, but it provided blessed relief from the wind and snow. Jonah immediately began gathering what dry wood he could find, while Miriam unpacked their supplies and prepared a meal from their dwindling rations. "How long do storms like this usually last?" she asked as they huddled around a small fire. "Could be hours, could be days. Mountain weather's unpredictable." Jonah looked out at the white curtain of snow that had already reduced visibility to just a few yards. "The good news is that if we can't travel, neither can those bounty hunters. And the bad news, we're burning through our supplies. We're still a day short of Silver Creek, and every hour we spend here increases the chance that we'll get trapped by weather." As if to emphasize his point, a tremendous gust of wind howled past the cave mouth, driving snow deep into their shelter despite the rocky overhang. The storm was intensifying rapidly, developing into the kind of blizzard that could bury travelers alive. "We should have stayed at Samuel's cabin," Miriam said quietly. "Tried to wait out the bounty hunters instead of running into this." Samuel's cabin wasn't safe anymore. You heard those men, they knew we'd been there. Jonah added another piece of wood to their small fire. Besides, staying would have just delayed the inevitable. Eventually, we'd have had to make this crossing or give up completely. Maybe giving up would have been smarter. "Do you really believe that—" Miriam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind. "No, but I'm scared, Jonah. What if we don't make it? What if we freeze to death up here or get caught by those men or—" "Hey." Jonah moved closer to her, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to meet his, and he could see the fear there, but also the same determined spirit that had driven her out into a blizzard rather than accept a life of bondage. "We're going to make it." he said with quiet conviction. You know how I know. How? Because we've come too far to quit now. Because we've found something worth fighting for. And because sometimes the mountain tests you just to see if you're strong enough to deserve what's waiting on the other side. What's waiting on the other side? Freedom. A chance to build the life we want instead of accepting the one other people chose for us. A future where we don't have to hide or run or apologize for loving each other. Before Miriam could respond, a new sound cut through the storm's roar, the distant crack of a rifle shot muffled by snow and wind, but unmistakably human. Then another shot and another. They followed us up here, Jonah said grimly, reaching for his rifle. In this storm. That's impossible. No one would be crazy enough to... Another shot closer this time, followed by a human voice shouting something unintelligible through the wind. Desperate men do desperate things, Jonah said, checking his ammunition. And $50 is a lot of money to men who don't have any. What do? We get ready to fight. He looked at her seriously. Miriam, I need you to promise me something. What? If something happens to me, if these men get past me somehow, you don't let them take you alive. Samuel was right about there being more to this than just an arranged marriage. Men don't risk their lives in storms like this for ordinary bounty money. Jonah, don't talk like that. Promise me. His voice carried an urgency that made her stomach clench with fear. Whatever they want you for, it's not something you'd survive with your soul intact. Promise me you'll find a way to end it on your own terms if it comes to that. The weight of what he was asking hit her like a physical blow. But looking into his eyes, seeing the love and desperation there, she understood that he was asking because he couldn't bear the thought of her suffering whatever fate awaited captured runaways. I promise, she whispered. The voices were getting closer now. Multiple men calling to each other as they searched the mountainside. Jonah positioned himself at the cave mouth, rifle ready, while Miriam gathered their supplies and prepared to move quickly if escape became possible. How many do you think? She asked. Hard to tell in this storm. At least 3, maybe more. Jonah's voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. They must be following our tracks, or they'd never have found this place. A figure appeared through the swirling snow, moving carefully up the trail toward their cave. Then another and another. 5 men, all armed, all looking like they meant business despite the brutal weather. Mountain man! The lead hunter's voice carried clearly through the wind. We know you're in there. Come on out and let's end this before we all freeze to death. Jonah didn't respond, keeping his rifle trained on the approaching figures. We're not going away, the man continued. We've come too far and risked too much to give up now. Send out the girl and we'll let you walk away. Like hell, Jonah muttered under his breath. Be reasonable. The bounty hunter was close enough now that they could see his face red with cold and twisted with determination. She's not worth dying for, just another runaway who'll cause you nothing but trouble. That was the wrong thing to say. Jonah's finger tightened on the trigger and his voice rang out across the mountainside with deadly authority. She's worth more than all of you put together, and the only way you're taking her is over my dead body. That can be arranged, the man snarled back. The shooting started a heartbeat later, muzzle flashes lighting up the storm as both sides opened fire. Jonah had the advantage of position and cover, but the bounty hunters had superior numbers and desperation on their side. Bullets chipped rock from the cave walls and sent sparks flying from the stone floor. Stay down, Jonah shouted to Miriam as he returned fire, his shots carefully aimed despite the poor visibility. One of the bounty hunters spun and fell, clutching his leg, but the others pressed forward. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sound of gunfire echoing off the mountain peaks like thunder. Jonah was a skilled marksman, but his wounded shoulder was affecting his accuracy, and the bounty hunters were learning to use the storm for cover. Then disaster struck. A ricocheting bullet caught Jonah in the side, spinning him around and sending him crashing against the cave wall. Blood spread across his shirt as he struggled to maintain his position, but his strength was fading fast. "Jonah!" Miriam scrambled to his side, pressing her hands against the wound to try to stop the bleeding. "The rifle!" he gasped. "Take the rifle." "I don't know how to." "Point and pull the trigger. It's our only chance." With trembling hands, Miriam picked up the heavy weapon, its weight unfamiliar and frightening. The bounty hunters were advancing again, sensing that their quarry was weakened. "Last chance," the leader called out. "Surrender now, and we'll make it quick." Miriam raised the rifle to her shoulder, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, but somehow the shot found its mark. The lead bounty hunter staggered and fell, blood staining the snow around him. The remaining hunters hesitated, suddenly realizing that their easy prey had become dangerous. In that moment of uncertainty, the mountain itself intervened. A deep, rumbling sound began somewhere high above them, growing louder by the second. "Avalanche!" one of the bounty hunters screamed. The sound became a roar as tons of snow and ice broke loose from the peaks above, thundering down the mountainside with the force of a freight train. The bounty hunters scattered, abandoning their pursuit as they ran for their lives from nature's ultimate weapon. Jonah and Miriam pressed themselves against the back wall of their cave as the avalanche swept past, a white wall of destruction that obliterated the trail and everything on it. When the rumbling finally stopped, an eerie silence settled over the mountain, broken only by the wind and their own ragged breathing. "Are they gone?" Miriam whispered. Jonah struggled to the cave mouth and peered out into the storm. Where the trail had been, there was now a field of snow and debris 20 feet deep. Whatever had happened to the bounty hunters, they were no longer a threat. "Gone," he confirmed, then collapsed as blood loss and exhaustion finally overwhelmed him. Miriam found herself alone on a storm-swept mountain with a badly wounded man and no clear path forward. But as she looked at Jonah's pale face and felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her hands, she realized that alone wasn't the same as defeated. She had survived an arranged marriage, escaped into a blizzard-crossed impossible country, and faced down armed men. She had found love in the most unlikely place and discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. The storm still raged outside their shelter, and Silver Creek remained a day's journey away through treacherous country. But for the first time since leaving her Amish community, Miriam felt truly free, free to fight for what she wanted, free to protect the man she loved, free to choose her own destiny regardless of what the world thought she deserved. The mountain had tested them and found them worthy. Now all that remained was to survive the night and find their way to the new life waiting beyond the divide. The night passed in a blur of desperate activity as Miriam fought to keep Jonah alive. Using strips torn from her own petticoat, she packed his wounds as tightly as she dared, then wrapped him in every blanket they possessed. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale and cold to the touch, but his pulse remained steady beneath her fingertips, like a stubborn promise that he wouldn't give up without a fight. The storm raged outside their cave with renewed fury, as if the mountain was expressing its own anger at the violence that had taken place on its slopes. Snow drifted into their shelter despite the rocky overhang, and the wind howled like a living thing seeking entry to their fragile sanctuary. Miriam kept their small fire burning through the long hours, feeding it carefully hoarded pieces of wood while she whispered prayers in Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of her childhood coming naturally in moments of desperate need. "Don't you dare leave me," she murmured to Jonah's unconscious form, her hands never leaving the makeshift bandages that were slowly turning red despite her efforts. "Not now, not when we're so close to freedom, not when I've just learned what it means to love someone." Toward dawn, the bleeding finally stopped and Jonah's color began to improve slightly. He stirred restlessly, mumbling words she couldn't understand, but his fever seemed to be breaking. Miriam allowed herself a moment of hope, even as she counted their remaining supplies and realized how precarious their situation had become. The avalanche had blocked their route back down the mountain, but it had also eliminated any chance of pursuit. Whatever had happened to the bounty hunters, they were buried under tons of snow and would pose no further threat. The irony wasn't lost on her. The mountain that had nearly killed them had also been their salvation. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the storm clouds, Jonah's eyes finally opened. He looked up at her with confusion, then growing awareness as memory returned. "The bounty hunters, gone," Miriam said softly. "The avalanche took them. We're safe for now." Jonah tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his wounded side. "How long was I unconscious?" "All night. You lost a lot of blood, Jonah. We need to get you to a doctor." "Silver Creek," he said weakly. "How far?" Miriam consulted Samuel's map, trying to orient herself in the changed landscape outside their cave. "Maybe 8 miles, but the trail's completely blocked now. I don't know if there's another way over the divide." "There is." Jonah's voice was barely above a whisper, but his eyes held determination. "The old mining road. It's longer, but it goes around the avalanche zone. Adds maybe 4 hours to the journey. You can't travel 4 hours in your condition." "I can't stay here either. We're out of food, almost out of wood, and there's another storm coming." He gestured weakly toward the cave mouth where fresh snow was beginning to fall again. "This weather pattern could last for days. We'll starve or freeze before it breaks." Miriam knew he was right, but the thought of moving him in his weakened state terrified her. Still staying in the cave was a slower form of death sentence. At least on the trail they had a chance. "All right," she said finally, "but we do this my way, slow and careful with plenty of rest stops, and if you collapse, we find shelter and wait no matter how long it takes." "Agreed." Jonah managed a weak smile. "Help me up. Let's see how much damage those bastards did." Getting him to his feet was an ordeal that left both of them shaking with effort. The bullet had passed through his side without hitting any vital organs but the blood loss, and shock had weakened him considerably. Still, he was able to stand and take a few experimental steps, leaning heavily on Miriam's shoulder. "The mining road starts about a mile north of here," he said, studying the map with bleary eyes. "We follow the ridge line until we hit the old workings, then take the road down into the Silver Creek Valley." They packed their remaining supplies with meticulous care, knowing that every ounce would matter in the difficult journey ahead. Miriam fashioned a crude walking stick for Jonah from a piece of deadfall, and they set out into the gray morning light with the determination of people who had already survived too much to give up now. The mile to the mining road felt like 10 as they struggled through snow that was often knee-deep, with Jonah leaning more heavily on Miriam with each step. His breathing was labored, and she could see the pain in his eyes, despite his efforts to hide it. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, driven by the same stubborn will that had brought him through 21 years of solitary waiting. The old mining road, when they finally reached it, was a revelation. Built to accommodate ore wagons, it was wider and more gently graded than the Indian Trail, with stone retaining walls that had protected it from the worst of the avalanche damage. Snow had drifted across it in places, but the underlying surface was solid and predictable. "Thank God," Miriam breathed as they started down the winding path. "This is actually manageable." For the first time since leaving Samuel's cabin, they were able to make steady progress without constantly fighting the terrain. The road descended gradually through stands of pine and aspen, following the contours of the mountainside rather than attacking them head-on. Even in Jonah's weakened condition, they covered ground at a respectable pace. But as they descended, new challenges emerged. The lower elevation brought warmer temperatures, which meant the snow was becoming wet and heavy, clinging to their clothes and making every step an effort. Worse, they could hear the ominous sound of rushing water ahead. Snowmelt was turning every creek and stream into a potential torrent. "Bridge is out," Jonah said, as they crested a small rise and saw the obstacle ahead. A wooden trestle that had once carried the mining road across a narrow gorge had collapsed, leaving a gap of 30 feet, with a raging creek 40 feet below. "Is there another way across?" Jonah studied the terrain with the eye of a man who'd spent his life reading mountain geography. Maybe. There's a narrower spot about a quarter-mile upstream where we might be able to jump across, but it's risky, especially with me in this condition. They made their way upstream, following what remained of an old pack trail that paralleled the creek. The sound of rushing water grew louder as snowmelt poured down from the high peaks, turning what had probably been a placid stream into a coffee-colored torrent full of debris and foam. The narrow spot Jonah had mentioned was indeed crossable barely. Two large boulders created natural stepping stones, but they were separated by gaps of 8 to 10 feet over rushing water that would sweep away anyone unlucky enough to fall in. "I'll go first," Miriam said, studying the crossing carefully. "If I make it, I can help guide you across." "Miriam, if you fall, then you'll fish me out downstream and we'll try again." She managed to smile despite her fear. I didn't come this far to be stopped by a creek. The first jump was terrifying but successful, her momentum carrying her safely to the middle boulder despite its slippery surface. The second jump required more faith than skill. A leap into space over churning water with nothing but trust in her own ability to reach the far side. She landed hard on the rocky bank, rolling to absorb the impact and coming up with scraped hands but intact bones. "Your turn," she called back to Jonah. Watching him attempt the crossing was agony. His first jump barely made it to the middle boulder, and he nearly lost his balance on the slick surface. The second jump was even more precarious. He launched himself across the gap with obvious pain, landed short of solid ground, and had to scramble up the muddy bank while Miriam grabbed his arms and pulled. "Made it!" he gasped, collapsing on the far side with his face gray from exertion and pain. "Rest," Miriam commanded. "We're not moving until you get your strength back." They huddled together on the creek bank, sharing body heat and the last of their water, while the sound of rushing water filled the air around them. Jonah's wounds had started bleeding again during the crossing, and Miriam did what she could to redress them with their dwindling medical supplies. "How much farther?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Maybe 3 miles to the outskirts of town, but it's the hardest 3 miles. The road switchbacks down a steep slope and there are more creek crossings." As if summoned by his words, the sound of voices drifted up from the valley below. Not the harsh voices of bounty hunters this time, but the cheerful calls of people who belonged in this country, locals who knew the land and moved through it with confidence. "Travelers," Jonah said, hope creeping into his voice. "Maybe we can get help." A few minutes later, 3 men on horseback came into view, riding up the mining road with the easy competence of people accustomed to mountain travel. They spotted Jonah and Miriam immediately and spurred their horses forward. "Well, I'll be damned," the lead rider said as he dismounted. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors. "What are you folks doing way up here? You look like you've been through hell." "We have," Jonah admitted. "I'm wounded. We're out of supplies and we're trying to get to Silver Creek." "Silver Creek. That's where we're headed." The man extended his hand. "Name's Tom Bradley. I run the general store there. These are my brothers, Jim and Pete. We were coming up to check the mining claims after the storm." "Jonah McBride, and this is Miriam Stoltzfus." Jonah accepted the handshake gratefully. "We've had some trouble with bounty hunters. They're not a problem anymore, but I need medical attention." Tom's expression grew serious as he took in Jonah's obvious wounds and their desperate condition. "Bounty hunters, you say? What kind of bounty? The kind that makes men do stupid things for money?" Miriam said carefully. "Fair enough. None of my business anyway." Tom turned to his brothers. "Jim, give me your horse. We'll get these folks down to town and let Doc Patterson have a look at him." The brothers immediately began rearranging their equipment to accommodate 2 additional passengers. Within minutes, Jonah was mounted on a sturdy bay horse, with Tom walking alongside to steady him while Miriam rode behind Pete on a reliable pack animal. The descent to Silver Creek was a revelation after their ordeal in the high country. The mining road was well maintained in the lower sections, and they made excellent time despite Jonah's condition. As they lost elevation, the snow gave way to patches of bare ground, and the air grew noticeably warmer. "Beautiful country," Miriam observed as they emerged from the forest into a broad valley dotted with mining claims and small farms. "Best place on earth, if you ask me," Tom replied. "Plenty of opportunities for folks willing to work hard and mind their own business." Silver Creek itself was larger than Miriam had expected, maybe 300 people, with a main street lined with substantial buildings and several side streets spreading up the hillsides. There was a bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, and all the other establishments that marked a community moving beyond mere survival toward real prosperity. "Doc Patterson's office is just ahead," Tom said, pointing to a neat white building with a painted sign. "Best doctor between here and Denver, and he won't ask questions you don't want to answer." Dr. Patterson proved to be a competent, no-nonsense physician who took one look at Jonah's wounds and immediately began issuing orders. Within an hour, Jonah was cleaned, stitched, bandaged, and installed in a comfortable bed with strict instructions to rest for at least a week. "You're lucky," the doctor told him as he finished his examination. "Another few hours and infection might have set in. As it is, you'll be fine if you take care of yourself." "What about travel?" Jonah asked. "When can we move on?" "Move on?" Dr. Patterson looked puzzled. "Son, you just got here. Where exactly did you think you were going?" Jonah and Miriam exchanged glances. In their desperation to reach safety, they hadn't thought much beyond Silver Creek itself. Now, faced with the reality of starting new lives in an unfamiliar place, the magnitude of their situation began to sink in. "We need work," Miriam said quietly. "Somewhere to live. We don't have much money." "Well, you've come to the right place for that," Dr. Patterson said cheerfully. "Silver Creek's growing so fast we can barely keep up. There's work for anyone willing to do it, and boarding houses for folks getting established." Tom Bradley, who had remained to see how Jonah was doing, nodded enthusiastically. "That's the truth. My store's been so busy I've been thinking about hiring help, and Pete mentioned that his wife's been looking for someone to help with the children and the boarding house." "Boarding house?" Miriam's interest was immediate. "Best one in town," Tom confirmed. "Pete's wife Sarah runs it, and she's been saying she needs someone who can cook and manage the household. The pay's decent, and it comes with room and board." For the first time since leaving her Amish community, Miriam began to see a concrete path forward. Cooking and household management were skills she'd learned from childhood, and the idea of honest work in exchange for security appealed to her deeply. "What about Jonah?" she asked. "When he's recovered, I mean." "Hunting guides are always in demand," Tom said. "Rich men from back east pay good money for someone who knows the country and can keep them alive in the wilderness. A man with your skills could make a good living at it. And there's always the mining claims," Dr. Patterson added. "Most of the good spots are taken, but there are still opportunities for men with the right knowledge and determination." That evening, as Jonah slept under the influence of laudanum, and Miriam sat beside his bed in the doctor's office, she had time to truly comprehend what they'd accomplished. 5 days ago, she'd been a trapped Amish woman facing an unwanted marriage to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Tonight, she was a free woman in a community that seemed willing to accept her without questions or judgments. The price had been higher than she'd ever imagined. The complete loss of her old life days of terror and hardship, the violent deaths of the men who'd pursued them. But looking at Jonah's peaceful face as he slept, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, she knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth every moment of suffering. "Miriam," his voice was soft, barely audible in the quiet room. "I'm here. We made it. Yes, we made it. No regrets." She thought about her family, who by now would have discovered her absence and drawn their own conclusions about her fate. She thought about the community that had shaped her, the faith that had sustained her, the simple life she'd abandoned for this uncertain freedom. "No regrets," she said firmly. "None at all." 3 days later, Jonah was well enough to take short walks around town, and Miriam had already started working at Sarah Bradley's boarding house. The work was familiar and satisfying, cooking, cleaning, managing the household affairs that kept a dozen boarders comfortable and well-fed. Sarah proved to be a kind woman with a sharp business sense, and she quickly recognized Miriam's competence and reliability. "You're a godsend," Sarah told her at the end of her first week. "I haven't had help this good since my sister moved to California. If you want to stay permanent, there's a partnership arrangement we could work out." Partnership, part ownership in the boarding house. "I'm getting older and my husband wants to focus on his mining interests. The right person could gradually take over the business with proper compensation, of course." It was an opportunity beyond Miriam's wildest dreams, not just employment, but the chance to build something of her own, to have a stake in her own future rather than depending on the charity of others. Meanwhile, Jonah was discovering that his reputation had preceded him to Silver Creek. Word of their ordeal in the mountains had spread through the community, enhanced by the discovery of the avalanche site where the bounty hunters had met their fate. Far from being seen as troublemakers, they were viewed as survivors who'd proven themselves against both human enemies and the mountain itself. "You're exactly what we need for the hunting guide business," a local entrepreneur named Marcus Webb told him over coffee at the hotel. "City folks want authenticity, and you've got more authentic mountain experience than anyone else in the territory. I can set you up with clients, provide equipment, handle the business side. We split the profits 50-50. The offer was generous and exactly the kind of work Jonah knew he could excel at. Guiding hunters and fishermen through the wilderness would utilize all his skills, while providing a good living, and the partnership arrangement meant he wouldn't have to handle the aspects of business he found distasteful. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Jonah and Miriam settled into their new lives with a contentment neither had ever expected to find. Their love, tested by hardship and danger, deepened into something solid and enduring. They were married in a simple ceremony at the community church, with Tom Bradley giving Miriam away and half the town in attendance. The wedding was nothing like the elaborate Amish ceremonies of Miriam's youth, but it was infinitely more meaningful because it represented choice rather than obligation. As they exchanged vows in front of friends who had accepted them without question, both of them felt the last chains of their old lives finally fall away. Their honeymoon was a week-long hunting trip into the high country, just the two of them and the mountains that had tested them so severely. They made camp at a meadow overlooking the valley where Samuel's cabin had stood, now empty and slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. "Do you think he made it?" Miriam asked as they sat by their campfire watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. "Samuel, I think that old man will outlive us all," Jonah said confidently. "He's probably holed up in some other cabin telling some other desperate traveler that everyone deserves a chance to choose their own path." "I hope so. I'd like to see him again someday to thank him properly." "Maybe we will. These mountains have a way of bringing people together when they need each other most." As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar figure emerged from the tree line leading a pack horse. Samuel Hartwell, looking none the worse for wear despite his supposed encounter with bounty hunters, rode into their camp with the same calm competence he'd shown during their first meeting. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, dismounting and accepting their embrace. "I was hoping I'd run into you two again." "Samuel," Miriam's joy was evident in her voice. "We thought you might be dead." "Those men at your cabin, those idiots." Samuel laughed. "They spent an hour threatening me, then rode off convinced you'd headed south toward the main road. I sent them on a wild goose chase that probably had them searching empty country for days. But we heard gunshots. Warning shots, mostly. One of them got a little too aggressive, so I had to put a bullet in his shoulder to adjust his attitude. After that, they were much more reasonable." They spent the evening catching up with Samuel, expressing satisfaction at how well they'd adapted to their new lives in Silver Creek. His approval meant more to them than they'd expected. He'd been the first person to believe in their love, the first to offer practical help in building a future together. "You've done well," he told them as they prepared to part ways the next morning. "Better than most folks manage when they're forced to start over from nothing." "We had good advice," Jonah replied, "and good help when we needed it most." "That's what neighbors are for," Samuel said gruffly. "But the courage to act on that advice, the strength to see it through when things got difficult, that came from inside you. Don't ever forget that." As they watched him ride away into the morning mist, Miriam leaned against Jonah's shoulder and felt a deep sense of completion. They'd left everything behind to find each other, crossed impossible country to reach safety, and built new lives from nothing but determination and love. The mountains around them stood eternal and unchanging witnesses to their transformation from desperate fugitives into confident partners in life and business. Silver Creek spread below them in the valley, bustling with the energy of a community that had welcomed them without reservation. "No regrets?" Jonah asked, echoing the question from that first night in Dr. Patterson's office. "None," Miriam replied with absolute certainty. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be." And as they rode back toward their new home, their new life, their new beginning, both of them knew with the confidence of people who'd survived the ultimate test, that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as equals, as partners, as two souls who had chosen love over security and found both in abundance on the other side of the mountain.